From our nation's founding until this century began, politicians accumulated $3.4 trillion of debt. But then, in just 8 years, George W. Bush borrowed another $4 trillion from private credit markets, and now Obama is continuing Bush's big government approach. I'm Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute. In this short Center for Freedom and Prosperity video, we're going to talk about this explosion of government borrowing and what it means for America's economy. First, some good news. Government debt is not necessarily a bad thing. We went into debt to win World War II, and I hope all of us agree that was a worthwhile expenditure. Another bit of good news is that deficits and debt can be very manageable if politicians show even a modicum of restraint. After World War II, U.S. government debt exceeded 100% of America's gross domestic product. And, as the chart shows, the total amount of debt continued to grow for the rest of the 20th century. But because our economy grew even faster, debt as a share of economic output dropped, which meant it became increasingly easy to pay the interest on the debt. The analogy is far from perfect, but government borrowing is a bit like household borrowing. If a family borrows to start a business, finance a child's education, or buy a house, that may be a very sensible financial choice. But if money is borrowed to finance a shopping binge, a week in Vegas, or a round-the-world cruise, that may not be so smart, at least if there isn't enough disposable income to pay the interest and pay off the debt. In other words, while it is generally a good idea to avoid debt, borrowing is quite defensible if the money is being used for things that generate long-term benefits. But now, let's turn to the bad news. Politicians, and I realize this is an understatement, are not exactly role models of financial prudence. We added $40 trillion of debt under big spender Bush. Does anybody think that America is getting long-term benefits from the no bureaucrat left behind education bill, the 2 corrupt farm bills, the giant Medicare entitlement expansion, the pork-filled transportation bills, or the sleazy bailouts? Or what about the several trillion of additional debt under big spender Obama? That money is being used to finance takeovers of the auto industry, more bank bailouts, a so-called stimulus, and other big government schemes. Is anybody naive enough to think this orgy of new spending is going to yield dividends for the American economy? The answer, of course, is no. The Bush-Obama policies are turning America into a welfare state. And that means our economy will be weaker, not stronger. Now, let's shift to the really bad news. The Congressional Budget Office recently released long-term estimates showing what will happen to the national debt if current policies are allowed to continue. These estimates are uncertain, of course, but they show that government debt will climb to somewhere between 306% and 767% of GDP by 2080, 7 to 17 times larger than it is today when compared to economic output. This is very bad news, but the key thing to remember is that all this debt is just a symptom. The underlying disease is a rising burden of government spending. The Congressional Budget Office projects federal government spending is going to jump from 23% of GDP today to somewhere between 45% and 67% of GDP over the next 70 years. The politicians tell us that we can solve the problem by raising taxes, but that simply trades debt-financed government spending for tax-financed government spending. I'm not sure if this is jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, or vice versa, but I do know that you don't cure alcoholics by giving them more to drink, and we won't solve America's fiscal problems by giving politicians more to spend. Some people say that deficits are bad because they divert funds from private credit markets, thus reducing investment and lowering long-term growth and hurting wages. This is certainly true, but replacing deficits with taxes is hardly a step in the right direction, since higher tax rates discourage work, saving, investment, and entrepreneurship, which also means less long-term growth and lower wages. In other words, a balanced budget, or even a budget surplus, is not economic nirvana. Before concluding, we should briefly talk about inflation. As nations such as Argentina and Zimbabwe demonstrate, deficits can lead to disaster if they are financed by printing money. And since there already is plenty of reason to be concerned that the Federal Reserve is debasing the value of the dollar, this is a cause for worry. But the key thing to remember is that the economic damage is caused by inflation, not by deficits. America does face a huge financial challenge, but that challenge is growing government, not growing deficits. A balanced budget is a good idea, of course, but the main goal should be small government, as America's founding fathers set forth in the Constitution. Thanks for giving us some of your time. Please help the Center for Freedom and Prosperity spread the message by sharing this video widely.